portoghese muito básico, então espero que me perdoem por apresentar isso em inglês. It's a great pleasure to be here and thank everyone involved with the conference, especially William for inviting me. We first met at a conference in Sao Paulo about 5 years ago, and I was extremely pleased that he saw fit to translate some of my articles relating to the relationship between practice and research, and also relating to the whole field of performance studies in Portuguese. So hopefully some of you might have been able to read them, but William can certainly give you pointers to those if you are interested. So, let me just get my clicker. From the late 18th century onwards, there have been any number of methods. Some of these have been inscribed in the form of treatises, which may not always have represented what their authors themselves did, or even necessarily what they taught in person, but nonetheless represent a vital set of primary sources. In other cases, the performers or pedagogues never left a full method for the instrument, but a reasonable amount can be deduced about their playing from accounts by their students or onlookers. Obvious examples of this are the cases of Chopin and Liszt. In this paper, I'm concentrating specifically on the mechanical approach to the instrument, found across a range of methods. This is not in order to discount or marginalize wider questions of musical diction, interpretation, style. On the contrary, I think these things are inseparable from the mechanics of the instrument and the way of approaching it. And so what I'm looking at in particular is what such mechanics mean in terms of the sound made. Now, my own approach developed from, particularly from about the age of 18, my own approach to the keyboard and the human performing mechanism. I sort of reworked this anew at the age of 18, drawn to the methods of George Shandor, who I later studied with, as these were laid out in his book on piano playing, which was published in 1981 and was read in 1986. From there, I'll come back to talking about that a little later. But from that point onwards, I've very keenly observed how a whole range of pianists approach the instrument. I've quite obsessively watched how they do so, watching videos and sometimes videoing people and watching them even in slow motion. As I'll come to at the very end of this talk, I discern a few basic categories in this respect. But the real focus here is the specific issue of whether one can produce differences of timbre at the piano independently of dynamics, and if so, what might be the technical means of so doing. This is an issue that can provoke extremely passionate, sometimes angry opinions of various types from pianophiles. And I will distill the question further. Is it possible to vary the timbre of a single note on the piano independently of dynamics? Now, of course, a large amount of pianistic repertoire consists not of single notes, but of lines, chords, polyphony, textures achieved through superimposed layers and so on. And in these cases, all sorts of issues of voicing, legato or staccato, articulation, pedaling, agogits, microdynamic variation, and then of course specific instruments and specific hall acoustics all come into play. All of these things produce timbral possibilities, not to mention further parameters when a performance is recorded. Then you have all the questions of the ways in which the microphone setup, the mixing and so on affect the piano timbre. But those of us who play some serial or other pointillistic music are perhaps more familiar with literally isolated single notes than others. Though I do think notes in relative isolation do play some part in some early repertoire. So, for the purpose of this paper, I want to keep that fundamental question in mind. So, let me return first to the human performing mechanism. These are illustrations taken from Shandor's book. It fundamentally consists of 4 components which have the potential to be used actively. The fingers, operated from the knuckles, but operated by muscles on both sides of the forearm. The hand, operated from the wrist. The forearm, operated from the elbow, and the upper arm, operated from the shoulder. The upper body generally supports these and delivers certain types of motions produced by the 4 components, but is only occasionally mobile in a way which feeds directly into the key. Now, the composer-pianist Ronald Stevenson once demonstrated to me a way in which Ferruccio Busoni apparently played the Chopin C minor prelude. I'll show you this. Quite visual, let's say, but I think on the whole this is more of a theatrical effect rather than having a major effect on the sound. When I talk about the motion of the wrist here, this involves a motion of the forearm which changes the position of the hand and fingers as well. And those 2 illustrations on the right show a low wrist and a high wrist in that respect. In Shandor's scheme, the ideal way of approaching a key for the most powerful sound with the least effort is perpendicular, in a direct vertical line, which can only be achieved through a distribution of motion amongst the whole arm. A throw from the elbow will always involve an arc. As it shows in that first diagram. If I play this just from here, I'm going in an arc motion down to the keys. That always, invariably, has a horizontal component to it, which causes a more indirect approach than the perpendicular one, which, as I'll come to again, I think that's of crucial importance. So I'll return later to the essential elements of Shandor's approach and how they differ from others. Questions of pedalling on the piano are, of course, highly important, as are those of voicing, but simply for reasons of time, I'll not be dealing primarily with those today. So, to return to this question of approaching the key via an arc, when the key is not approached in a perpendicular fashion, the motion has this horizontal component which must be absorbed somewhere because it cannot contribute to the descent of the key. How that is absorbed and how that translates from one form of energy to another is part of what I call key noise, the sound of the finger on the key, as a separate component of timbre from the sound of the hammer hitting the strings. Now, this certainly can be and is part of the sound even with a perpendicular throw or a fall under gravity, but I would argue that it can then be controlled more regularly. I don't believe key noise automatically is a bad thing, far from it. Indeed, I think it's a major factor in generating changes in timbre independently of dynamics. So what I want to do now is run through a range of methods, a range of historical methods, to consider how they conceive tone on the piano and what the physical means are which they advocate, starting with an important range of methods and teaching from the 1820s. Now, certainly various 19th century treatises and other accounts suggest that with a fair degree of agreement, that timbral variation on the piano is indeed a possibility. In Johann Nepomuk Hummel's treatise, he wrote about the importance of singing softness and tranquility in adagio sections, whereby the tones must persist, endure, and be bound together and made to sing through well-calibrated pressure. This was to be brought about by fine touch of the fingers, together with legato playing. However, Hummel taught a technique involving high fingers which should not stay on the keys longer than necessary so as to maintain clarity, with immobile arms and elbows close to the body. We should always bear in mind, of course, the instruments were very considerably lighter in the 1820s than the modern design of piano, which essentially comes into being in the late 1850s. But it would appear that for Hummel, timbre was really an issue of articulation, with a clear singing tone produced by differentiation of individual notes with selective use of legato. 4 years later, Friedrich Kalkbrenner, in his method, wrote that the piano was, quote, of all instruments the one whose sound can be most varied. Now he warned against playing with either straight or overly angled fingers, for which the hand takes the most natural position, he thought it should. The arm should stay perfectly still while the fingers make the action. The movement of the fingers consists only of the flanks attached to the hand. This is the most essential component of the mechanism upon which depends the sound of the piano, but yet that to which pianists attach least importance. I'm quoting Kalkbrenner here. The manner of striking the note should be infinitely varied, in line with the different sentiments to be expressed, sometimes with a caressing touch, sometimes in a precipitatory fashion, like a lion seizing its prey. However, in order to draw the sound the instrument can give, one should be careful not to strike it too violently, for one must play the piano and not be a boxer. That view would appear to me to be somewhat at odds with that of Hummel. His technique would indeed suggest straight or overly angled fingers, such as Kalkbrenner warned against. And it also suggests that to Kalkbrenner the finger acts as if it's in direct contact with the string, which is not. The keyboard mechanism comes between the fingers and the string. But that's the position that would later inform the teaching and theories of Joseph Levine. Now, the playing of John Field, as recounted through various Russian critics and pianists who knew him, such as Vladimir Odiyevsky, was said to be characterized by an emphasis upon color, as well as a lightness of touch, though others also described his touch as strong and brilliant. It's not easy to work out more exactly how Field played in a technical sense, but I'd speculate it may have resembled the playing of Chopin in various respects. As for the other major pianist of the 1820s, Ignaz Moscheles, he was said to play with an astonishingly round and full tone, whilst using only fingers for single notes. His bravura effects were contrasted with the pearl-like sounds of Hummel, and both camps had their own camps of followers. Moscheles expressed in 1822 an admiration for the fuller tone and better sonority of Broadwood's pianos with metal plates, and for the legato approach of Johann Baptist Kramer, with whom he was performing at the time. But nonetheless, he preferred what he called the greater flexibility of Clementi's repeated mechanism in order to play repeated notes, jumps and intervals, and also found the touch of the new Erard pianos to be too heavy. Nonetheless, Moscheles changed his mind when Erard came to adopt a double escapement action. Now, the French-Belgian critic François-Joseph Fétis wrote a treatise on piano playing co-authored with Moscheles, and he noted how Moscheles apparently used a stiff wrist when playing passages in sixths and octaves, which was contrasted with the loose approach of Kalkbrenner. And Fétis said, "The smooth, equal and polished styles of Clementi and Kramer are remarkable for great mechanical correctness and graceful facility. In their schools, all is beautiful, pure and regular. They admit no such artificial modes of producing tone as may be observed in the school of Hummel, and still more in that of Moscheles. The latter has several different modes of attacking the key, according to the effect he wishes to produce, and it is universally allowed that he does not resort in vain to the use of these ingenious contrivances of art peculiar to himself, his style being alike remarkable for variety and brilliancy. So, at least according to Fétis's account, the idea of the mode of attack of the keys producing a palpable change in timbre was an important factor in the playing of moscheles, though much less so in the distinct styles of Clementi and Kramer. So, Frédéric Chopin, who admired both Field and Kalkbrenner, he also believes it was possible to achieve variety of sound on the keyboard, writing in his sketch for a piano method of the importance of positioning the hand with relation to the keys to obtain the most beautiful quality, and also preserving the individual qualities of each finger rather than attempting to equalize them. And that's often thought to be a distinction between his playing and that of Liszt. Princess Marcelina Shakatistya recalled how Chopin, as well as prioritizing legato playing in the manner of Kramer and Clementi, thought the pianist should grip the keys and modify the weight of the fingers, whilst staccato playing should be like a violin pizzicato. Notoriously, Chopin spoke about how, when I'm not in my best form, I prefer Erard's piano, where I can easily find a ready-made piano tone. But when I'm in a good mood and strong enough to find my own piano tone, I prefer one of Pleyel's pianos. So what this shows is that at least in the Pleyel instrument, Chopin did believe that variety of tone was possible. Now the playing of Sigismund Thalberg, who had studied with Kalkbrenner, was also noted by many for its vocality, its singing qualities, in a manner which was likely to have been considerably less subtle than that of Chopin, entailing stark foregrounding of a melodic line above all others, without many possibilities of more intricate counterpoint. His own music does not really demand this in the way that is true of Chopin. Henri Blanchard wrote of how, when Thalberg played, one would forget the dryness of his mechanical instrument and instead hear the sound held, singing, crying, like greasy Malibran, De Berry or Rubini, a range of instrumentalists and singers. And this was in strong contrast to reports of Thalberg's arch-rival, Franz Liszt, from the same time. One critique of Liszt said that Liszt has no touch, but he makes the tones awaken, live, grow, and soar through a subtle handling of the keys. While Henry Chorley, in an otherwise adulatory account, wrote that in uniform richness and sweetness of tone, he, Liszt, may have been surpassed. An article by Joseph Fischoff in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik in 1838 also ranked Liszt relatively low on beauty of touch. Just returning to Thalberg, his set of stylistic principles, as laid down in the preface to his series of transcriptions, du chant appliqué au piano, 70, which was published in the 1850s and 1860s, did not really catch on in much pedagogical literature, nor in other writings on the piano and pianists. Many throughout the 20th century continued to insist on the individuality of a pianist's tone and an intimate relationship between the means of striking the key and the resultant timbre. To this day, to give an example, so I won't read this one all out. Here is stuff from Joseph Levine that I mentioned before. He talks about Rubinstein. He talks about the thicker cushions of flesh on Rubinstein's fingertips, and that produces a variety of touch. And he compares it to playing the xylophone. If they're struck with a hard metal rod, the tone is harsh and metallic. He says, let them be struck with an end, with a rod the end of which is covered with soft felt, and the tone is entirely different. You may not think this applies to the tone of the pianoforte. I certainly don't think it applies to that. It's a different instrument, a very different mechanism. It's not at all like the xylophone. It goes on to say, wider things, essentially continuing the same points about possibly a bony finger, the use of the fingernail, and so on. Now, however, I don't think what Levine says is without some merit when we look at this element of key knowledge that I'm going to come to. So, I just want to draw your attention to a passage from Charles Rosen in his much later book, 2002 Piano Notes. He also argues that tone is an illusion and comes from broader aspects of playing. Says there's no way of pushing down a key more gracefully that will make the slightest difference to the resulting sound. There are indeed different kinds of tonal beauty, but they don't come from the way any individual note is produced. And that a singing sound is about how a specific musical phrase is exploited, and that's not mechanical. It's all about music. It's about shaping the melody and moulding the harmony and counterpoint, and then the harmonies vibrate and the melody has a unified and convincing contour. The sound is beautiful. And in a later passage in the same book, he says what playing with a beautiful sound generally means is a particular style. The melodic voice is set slightly in relief over the accompaniment, violently contrasting accents are avoided, and the pedal is used throughout, but with discretion, avoiding any suggestion either of harmonic blur or of a scientific or of a dry sonority. This beautiful sound is international, though modified slightly in different national cultures. In much French pianism, for example, the melody is not quite so prominently set over the other voices as in the Viennese school. The latter style is best characterized by Busoni's remark, any melody worth playing should be played mezzo forte. Now, Chandor, in a passage from On Piano Playing, he actually speaks sarcastically of what he says are the attempts by scientific experts, such as those I was talking about before, to prove that one cannot affect tone on the piano. However, he does concede that this may be correct for a single note. It may be the case for that variation of tone independently of dynamics is not possible. And that view was very strongly disputed by the pianist Boris Berman in his book Notes on the Pianist's Bench, which is very critical of Chandor in many respects. And he maintains the importance of the parameter of weight in producing depth of tone. Only one other writer at this stage had really noticed, with this stage I mean I'm going back to the early 20th century, had noticed a dimension which had eluded those piano theoreticians and scientists. And this was Ludwig Riemann in his Das Wesen der Klavierklanges und seine Beziehungen zum Anschlag in 1911. This is a complex book that analyzes every possible component of piano sound, and he looks at noise elements, and in particular the sound of the finger, and by extension the rest of the body, upon the keys. He noticed in particular that this type of sound, which I should call key noise, was practically eliminated from those within the weight school, such as I was demonstrating, the school coming from Breithardt, since the fingers tended to remain in intimate communion with the keys as they supported the weight of the arm. Now, a few writers picked up on Riemann's ideas. Ortmann mentioned the sound of the finger on the key as the only noise parameter the pianist could control, whilst Karl Adolf Martinsson in his Die individuelle Klaviertechnik auf der Grundlage des schöpferischen Klangwillens used Riemann as the means of arguing against Tetzel. And then there was an important article, I think so, by Julius G. Barron and J. Hollow, published in 1935, in which they stressed how vital was this element of key noise, as did Numan Bartholomew in his 1942 book on acoustics. Barron wrote a letter to the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 1958 to emphasize further how audible are the extra noises on the piano. And this letter would be later taken up by Geoffrey Payzant in his study Glenn Gould, Music and Mind, published in 1984. There's a chapter in this entitled Burnish Singing Tone, which looks not only at Gould's work, but at piano tone in general. And I love this quote. It does not matter whether a key is depressed by the finger of Arthur Rubinstein or by the tip of his umbrella. Only one variable is controlled by the piano key and the manner in which it is depressed, and that is the velocity of the hammer at the instant it strikes the strings. There are not two or more different ways of travelling at the same velocity along the same arc as the hammer must do. Does anyone have an umbrella here by any chance? Or what would be equivalent to an umbrella? Got some rod or something?
Pencil.
Great.
Okay.
Excellent. This might strike more than one key because of its size. Let's try this. You must hear the sound of the umbrella on the key there. I certainly can. Try again. This tapping is it's nothing to do with the hammer setting the string. It's just this sound. So it does matter. And it doesn't matter whose umbrella it is, even if it's Arthur Rubinstein's. So Pace goes on to say, the velocity in the hammer in its turn controls two variables, but it controls neither independently of the other. These two variables are loudness and tone quality. For any given level of loudness, there can only be one tone quality, and any particular tone quality can only be delivered at its precisely corresponding level of loudness. The same is not true of voice, strings, or winds, on all of which some measure of independent control of either loudness or tone quality is possible under normal conditions. And Payson is very critical of particularly the view expressed by Levine, which I quoted earlier. In place of Levine's analogy of a xylophone mallet, Payson compares the piano to the fairground test, where some burly person, usually stripped down to the waist, takes a mallet to hit down a lever. It sends something flying up with enough force, if they've done it correctly, to hit a gong at the top. You must have seen that sort of thing. It's indirect. He hits something which sets something else into motion. It could be a she, of course, as well. But it was that book that first made me think about this aspect seriously at the piano. So those are most of my sources. There have been some more recent articles in scientific studies, but they've essentially gone over the same ground, so I won't come back to treatises now, other than now to look at Chandos. So, I just want to tell you very briefly about Chandos' methods. I found this book, as I say, in 1986. It just happened to be in my local library in my hometown in the northeast of England. And I was captivated by it and the methods it described. This was something so logical, so focused, and which in some ways gave such immediate results, like I'd never seen before. Most of the earlier technical teaching I'd received was vague, very little rationalised or theorised, based upon just received wisdom, very hazy conceptions of the instrument and of the human performing mechanism. I would say that's true of a lot of teaching in the UK, and on the whole, those who come through this education system and become accomplished at the keyboard have usually discovered technique for themselves or just had a natural aptitude. More systematic teaching is more rare and somewhat distrusted, and I think this plays a part in a culture of relative amateurism. So, let me show you the 5 elements in Chandos' methods. You can all still hear me all right when I'm standing here, away from the microphone. The first he describes is called the free fall, which simply involves a gradual raising of all the components of the anatomy, the fingers, the hand, the forearm, the other arm, and then letting them fall freely under gravity. Okay. The second, which he calls 5 finger scales arpeggio, is probably the most intricate of all. This involves, above all, aligning fingers with their forearm muscles. The finger is an extension of a muscle that goes right up to nearly to the elbow. And if the muscle's bent like that, there's a lot of tension created, or like that. If it's placed in a straight line with this forearm muscle, there is least tension, and so it can move with least friction. And this means changing the motion for each finger. So that is a good position for the thumb, that is one for the third finger, that for the fourth finger, and so on. And with that also comes a lateral motion of the wrist, so that mostly to try and make the last flanks of the finger strike the key vertically. So the highest wrist for the fifth finger, slightly lower for the fourth, and the third. Then this is also modified by a wider use of the wrist for phrasing, whereby he would say always begin a phrase with a low wrist and end it with a high wrist, so that that produces a general upward motion during the course of the phrase, which, same for short slurs, this causes the dampers to come down more slowly than they would do otherwise, and enables notes to blend into each other. In fact, let me try and play this in two different ways, beta and horizontal. Changing the end of each note, so the end is more rounded, and that's how he would say a real legato is produced. He also advocates keeping the fingers very slightly above the keys, not touching them, and then this motion of the wrist, put each in the right position, helps the motion, so the fingers don't feel like they're acting in isolation, and the wrist doesn't get stiff. His third motion, which is common, including in methods such as those of Depot and Breithout, is rotation. Simple axial rotation of the forearm to help the fingers. It's the same thing in passive motion. Larger intervals, this can be added with an axial rotation of the upper arm, which produces a lateral motion of the forearm. Let that for a while. And even in very big intervals, you can actually start having a lateral motion of the upper arm as well. The fourth motion he describes, the staccato, involves raising and lowering the hand, fingers, forearm and upper arm all simultaneously, so as the finger approaches the key in a perpendicular line. Do this slowly like that. Of course, you can change the amount of each. Motion, which is at odds with all the other four motions, he calls the thrust. And this is where you do touch the keys, always, playing from in contact with the keys, with a sudden, very rapid and contraction of the muscles of the chest and the shoulder. Can produce a very big sound, but with minimal key noise there. But he doesn't talk in terms of key noise as a factor. So those are the 5 elements. Now, as I say, his approach to the fingers requires not gripping nor continuously touching the keys, but keeping them slightly raised and helping with the wrist. And then this can make key noise practically non-existent. And let me demonstrate this with Rachmaninoff's G major prelude. Which one will affect the sound? It's because free-fall produces a greater amount of key noise and thus more of an attack. Hoping you agree with me that that produces quite a difference in sound. I should bring this up on here. A combination of higher fingers, free-fall and staccato, if used in certain ways, can produce varying amounts of key noise which can be controlled. And I find this a big asset when playing, for example, Stravinsky's piano rag music, where I want a very pointed, angular sound. Another example would be the opening of Alcan's Concerto for Solo Piano, which I played with very rich, sort of very high fingers staccato approach. And some Beethoven sonatas from the very first, Opus 2 number 1. Now listen to the difference if I play this with a more homogeneous motion and generally stay closer keys. Play it again in the first way. Judiciously, even in a piece of Debussy. In the second of the Image Book 2, in La Lune de Sens du Temple qui Fut, there are chords marked portato, but also those which are part of a continuous legato line. Both played with the pedal fully depressed to sustain the bass. Playing the first chords with more distance from the key does, I believe, make a difference here, as also does the element of release. If that's quicker, the sound of the key ascending and hitting the felt here appears to blend with the total sound. So let me play this from the second line. and in key release. The next example is the finale of Prokofiev's Seventh Sonata. I used to play this way. I've got to readjust to how I used to play something. So there's a lot of staccato in there. But listening to Prokofiev's own playing and that of his favoured interpreters, I came to realise that a throwing staccato, at the very least, is to be used more selectively here than, say, in music of Stravinsky. And this is true of a lot of Russian pieces. So I now play this with much less fingers and more wrist. When he does mark a clear staccato, it's then possible to make a real contrast. I'll show you on the next slide. Published just before Boulez completed his sonata. Personally, I'll go further than almost anywhere else in terms of using a throwing staccato, which produces, I think, an incorporated key noise in order to have a very sharp attack. So, you'll see that for those final chords, maybe we can have them just once more again. So, Horowitz uses pointed, quite rigid fingers and an arc motion from the elbow to strike the keys. See if I can imitate it. I'm not looking for comparisons with Horowitz, by the way. It's like this. Very martellato, a very characteristic sound of Horowitz, which in this case, I confess, makes me imagine the brutal suppression of the Polish uprising in 1830-31 by Russian troops. Now, of course, I know that Horowitz was Ukrainian Jewish, so I'm not looking to associate him with this, but it was a very particular type of sound. If you listen to, say, his recording of Liszt Valet Dobermann, where you have these repeated chords towards the end, which he usually play as if they're an extension of one sound. He plays them very detached, very martellato, and it's quite overwhelming. But I believe there's reason to think that Liszt may have done something like that himself. Let's now have Glenn Gould playing the first of the Goldberg variations. So for about 2 minutes 50 seconds. Very low elbow, also partially because he sits very low, and very high fingers most of the time. This is of course combined with very close miking. And it produces a very pointed and clearly articulated sound within which he can easily produce a whole range of accentuation. Legato playing is almost completely absent out there here and elsewhere in Gould's playing. And for another example, not so dissimilar, here is Pierre-Laurent Aimard playing the first Debussy etude. Again, but in a different way, we have very high fingers much of the time and a much lower wrist movement. And these things are quite consistent in Aimard's playing, irrespective of the piece. I obviously recognise this etude has a particular meaning in terms of finger exercises. The sound is always clear and well articulated, but again, legato is rare, especially in passage works. We go back to the slides briefly. So, Chandor often warned against the approaches of what he called the feelers, those pianists who always stay close to the keys. So I look for examples of this. One, according to an interview, is Byron Janis, who spoke once about playing with increasingly low wrists so that the fingers remain in contact with the keys. However, video material I found showed a quite different approach, which is in playing the Rachmaninoff Paganini Rhapsody. It was very high for the keys, very clear. So I could conclude that that feeling approach from Janis was probably only true at a certain point in his career. A better example is Earl Wild. In the volume of interviews with David Jubal, Reflection on the Keyboard, Wild makes clear his purported approach. So Jubal asked him about the sound he gets, the sheen, especially in the upper registers. He said, "I only lift my hands off the keyboard to relax the muscle of the arm. I never lose contact with the keys. By keeping your hands right on top of them, you have better contact and more tonal control." Now let's see the video of Wild playing Liszt and Sauce. Now, even from that video, and certainly studying lots of his other videos, Wilde does lose contact with the keys some of the time. He's not a pure feeler, but on the whole, he stays closer to the keys than most pianists. And this is a way of minimizing key noise. Now, Wilde was a pianist who fascinated me when I was younger, and still does. I was absolutely blown away by his recordings of Rachmaninoff concertos, by many virtuoso works of Liszt, Thalberg, Balakirev, Godowsky and others. And above all, by the sound he makes. Rarely, if ever, percussive, not so often producing a sustained big sound, more something in short bursts. So when I came to first learn his fantasy after Porgy and Bess, which I'm going to be performing tomorrow, this will be about 10 years ago when I first looked at it and played it about 4 or 5 times then before reviving it for now. I actually first thought I might try to see if I could do what he says, or as close to that as possible. So I was trying to play somewhat like this. Practicing that way was tortuous, and I remember feeling very uncomfortable with it. I was worried it was actually doing damage to my own technique. But by relaxing this a bit, but staying close to the keys than usual, and also using the Chandon technique of the thrust more frequently than usual, I was able to get, I feel, closer to the spirit of the playing. Let me give you just a few examples. I'll play this a bit more slowly so you can see more clearly what I'm doing. Need my other glasses. So this passage, instead of going, often in Wilde's playing, staccato is more a question of release than attack. So on the whole, I would use few full staccato throws, more cushioning the impact for a rounder rather than pointer set. Wrong page here. Somewhere I've got the second page of that. Anyhow, you can see what happens there. So I wouldn't do it. But even in someone else's arrangement of Gershwin, I might choose to do differently. Now, I just want to show you a few works. I wonder if we can have some lights down for this because it's difficult if you can't see the score. It's quite difficult to see with the full house lights on. A few contemporary works that actively, explicitly foreground key noise as a parameter. So I'll read the stuff from the, which means I need the other glasses, from the piano, so it'll be easy for me to read. One of these is Silvano Sotti's Pour Clavier, in which he actually asks the pianist to play with a quite counterintuitive fingering, and then just on the surface of the keys, without their actually sounding, so we only get the key noise. So on. Another examples Helmut Lackermann's Guerrero, in which the pianist plays a range of different glissandi on the surfaces of the keys, like that, better there, as well as some sort of staccato here. Eventually move inside these. Piece tends to work a bit better with amplification, but there is a lot of difference between the sounds depending on which fingers you use and where you're doing the sound. Klaus H. Huber's piece, Darabuka, which is named after an Arabic drum, is very largely focused on a central C sharp, one of a whole range of pieces he wrote, which exploit the timbres of single pitches. It uses a wide range of fingerings, which foreground the key noise. This is with all three fingers of both hands. That C sharp goes through all sorts of different sounds, even at a relatively consistent dynamic. Then Salvatore Sciarrino's Notturno Duo, 1999, requires the pianist to actually push the key down to the first escapement point and play from there without a note sounding. Very subtle, quite dependent on the instrument. And there have been a range of works written to me which make explicit use of key noise ever since I drew it to various composers' attention. Richard Emsley's 4 Piano 10 from 1999 instructs the pianist, who's otherwise playing flowing lines and contours, to introduce key noise so as to estrange the sound on certain pitches. In which he asks the pianist to play some elaborate configurations with as few notes sounding as possible. And here it's derived from some piano writing of Olivier Messiaen. In his 10 monophonic miniatures for solo pianist, has a whole new range of approaches to attacking a key. With the nail, with the knuckle, somewhere. It makes the whole choreography of playing a whole new parameter to consider, because you're always playing in very unusual, counterintuitive ways. There's also a piece by the British-German composer Wieland Hober, When the Panting Starts, which is also written by me. This is one notated on 10 staves, one for each finger, and there it uses lots of highly counterintuitive fingerings and other strategies to produce key noise. And then Richard Barrett, in his piece Lost, has in his play of figuration so that only key noise remains at the end. To actually do that, and it's not just playing it and letting it die away so then you have key noise. Actually, it requires a graduation of the touch, so that as the sound gets quieter, the amount of the fingers and the distance of the keys has to increase so as to foreground that. So, my last thing, and I'll finally wrap up here. Maybe we can have the house lights back on again. It's just this non-exhaustive taxonomy of schools of piano playing that I've observed here. The elbow school. This is a school of piano playing in which the upper arm remains essentially immobile, usually stays quite close to the body, and most motion comes either from the fingers acting essentially alone or from an arc-like motion of the forearm. So there's really just two types of motion, either stopping the fingers or a forearm throw. The use of the wrist and changes in its position can vary within the school, but it's perfectly possible and common for it to be a relatively secondary concern. Usually it is somewhere between moderately low and moderately high, but not in continuous motion. The very simplicity of the school playing is a reason I believe it's often associated with those who are especially precocious sight readers, as there are few complications to worry about. Pianists I would include in that category include George Schiffer, John Ogden, Marta Argerich, Peter Donahoe, Leslie Howard, Andres Schiff, Arthur Pizarro, Yuja Wang, and many others. Then I'd say the shoulder school, which is a school closer to the methods of Schandor, and generally involves a judicious use of all of the main parts of the anatomy. As I said, I date this back to Deborah. I think there's some evidence that Liszt played in a similar way. The wrist is almost never fixed, the arm helps the fingers, and staccato playing, especially octave, are distributed amongst all four components. Exponents will include Stanislav Neuhaus, Arthur Gieseking, Schandor himself, Michelangeli, or Murray Pariah. Then I talk about the Russian high wrist school, in which the wrist usually remains very high and a lot of motion comes from the fingers, looking slightly spidery, with a very highly legato touch as a default. They stay very close to the keys. Chords and octaves, though, are played quite differently, coming from either the elbow or the shoulder, but a staccato throw is strictly forbidden. Examples include Andrei Gavrilov, Boris Berezovsky, Yevgeny Kissin. And that says the Russian lower wrist school, which is similar, again of emphasis on fingers and legato, but the wrist is generally lower and the fingers can be raised a bit more. The forearm and upper arm are not immobile, but not used that extensively. And once again, staccato throws are excluded. Alexander Goldenweiser, Heinrich Neuhaus, Mikhail Rudi are the examples of this. I've a number of times played together with Rudi, and we were working on the four-hand or two pianos version of the Rite of Spring. And when we were coming to this passage, we're trying to coordinate our sounds, and I said, why do it like this? He said, I could never do that against all my training. We compromised in the end. Then, the French finger school, where a lot of motion comes from the hands and fingers, which are usually kept very high, only occasional use of the rest of the anatomy. The default touch is very clear and somewhat semi-staccato at least. Examples of this would be the piano of Marguerite Long, Samson Francois, Jean-Philippe Collard, Pierre-Laurent Aimard, and many others. The Waite school, which descended partially from Depper, but is more especially from Breithaupt, tending towards the fingers supporting the weight of the arm, so the finger's close to the key. Always a very full and rounded sound, less lightness or detachment. Examples here, which I mentioned before: Teresa Carreño, Claudio Arrau, Roberto Sidon, Gary Wilson. And then the feelers. The fingers remain close to the keys at all time, but that doesn't preclude some use of the wrist and arm, and indeed sometimes necessitates it. Old Wild is the clearest one. Another one I found a similar thing is the French pianist Georges Plutemaché. There are those who cross boundaries. I would categorize Maurizio Pollini as somewhere between the elbow and shoulder school, or Mikhail Pletnyov as somewhere between the elbow and Russian finger schools. Russian low wrist school. Pollini had a very individual and somewhat idiosyncratic technique, as did Sviatoslav Richter, which is somewhat like the Russian low wrist school. They work very well for them, but may not so easily form the basis of pedagogical method. Gould was closest to the French low wrist school, though with higher wrists, and he also used the elbow. There are also, of course, many pianists I've not mentioned, but on balance, I've found the majority fit into one of these categories. So, I hope you find this combination of research and self-reflection of the pianist to be of interest. That's the end of this talk, and I hope we'll have some interesting questions. Thank you.
Bom, pessoal, temos agora um breve tempo. Se alguém tem questões, também, se for necessário, seria possível traduzir para o professor sem problemas. Se alguém tem alguma questão ou comentários a fazer, por favor.
Em inglês ou português?
Preferido.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. I was struck by the first of all by the amount of literature that people here and the fact that in spite of all the pedagogic approach, searching for the way of approaching the keyboard, the sound actually in the end, at the end of the day, it's the hammer touching the strings, right?
And the fingers touching the keys.
Exactly, yeah. And what I was puzzled is all this contemporary approach to the keyboard, taking advantage, aesthetically speaking, of the keyboard, the sounds that we can take from the keyboard, just in terms of touching the keyboard, not the sound of the piano itself. So, I mean, it's more of a rhetorical question of any. Do you think that there's a belief that there's for some of these composers like Sciarrino or others that I can't remember right now, they believed some of them in the different approaches on the keyboard, making different sounds on the keyboard, on the piano, in spite of all what you said before, that actually, physically speaking, there is no such a thing.
Well, I think there is such a thing when one uses that element of the sound on the piano as, and is able to control it. But I think, where it's coming from with those contemporary composers, especially with figures like Lackerman and Sciarrino, is this thing which someone called decoupling of parameters, which has got more obvious application on wind and stringed instruments, where you can blow into a clarinet and produce very little sound, a lot of breath, or you can bow in such a way and bow other parts of the instrument, so mostly to produce something other than a pitch sound there. And people will be searching for some sort of equivalent to this on the piano. It's not so easy to do, but this use of key noise provides one means of doing that, and just estranging the sound of the performance of the instrument to turn it into something more concrete, more grounded, less phantasmagorical, if I was to get into the jargon here, something that draws attention to its means of production, to put this in the Marxist terms that some of those composers would use. So you're very aware of a physical act producing the sounds. They don't come from above, from the deity or something like that. They're very much grounded in actual human labour.
I see. I see.
That's what I'd like in not all of those cases, maybe not so much in Cressotti's case, which is a bit different, but certainly for Lackerman, Huber, and Scherino, and Cassidy, and Huber, and others, who are all coming from this sort of post-Frankfurt school attitude towards the very act of making music and the means of producing it.
Thank you.
Questões? I think, Professor, I have many, but one that probably is worth asking here. When you presented about Glengold, you said about close miking, and I was very concerned about this because I think in the same direction of Professor Germano, the way that the key noise can be really effective in listening to music is probably also depending on the means that the sound is projected in the value, but also in the recordings that mostly are references for sound or tone. So how much you think that in contemporary practices of recording, but also in kind of setting the concert, this element is being applied by pianists and consciously, at least by pedagogical people as well.
Well, and by engineers and
Yes.
tonmeisters in particular, and I will insist that what they're doing is an aesthetic project, not just a technical project. They're choosing a type of sound, hopefully in collaboration with the players, though sometimes the tonmeisters sort of, their word rules in that respect. It all has to do with aesthetic preferences in a sense. Gould clearly had a preference for a very dry and very close sound, and he worked very extensively with his engineers to get this, so there's no question that this is his own preference as well. It depends what sort of sound one likes, values, but I mean, if you're saying, does the factor of how it's recorded have a big impact? I'd say absolutely, and particularly the extent to which key noise filters through into recordings, because it's possible to record in a way where, just depending on the position of the microphone, very little of that key noise will be picked up. When I recorded Aaron Cassidy's pieces, we actually had extra mics right by the keyboard to make sure this came on a separate track so we could actually push it up on the recording. The piece is partially successful in a larger hall. You can hear key noise, but the finer differentiations between it, quite a bit of that inevitably gets a bit lost, I think. So I'm not sure you can get quite that whole intricate level of information coming through that the score would suggest. But you get some of it. But on recording, it is possible to get most of that, I would say. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. Mais alguma questão? Paulo.
Nice to meet you. I like very much your invitation again. I'd like to ask how do you balance between technical studies and musical studies with your students, making having as a goal the development of a natural, fluent technique, like something personal and not very attached to rules, but something that flows more naturally, like most of the players do.
Well, it depends what you call rules. So I prefer to call principles. I mean, I think there are principles about how the human mechanism works, which are relatively invariant amongst people, unless they've got some particular extreme condition. But the proportions of size, say, of fingers and hand, will differ for a lot of people, but the basic structure is always essentially the same. So when teaching with working with students, if some want to approach the keyboard in a quite different way, I'm fine with that. I wouldn't impose this on people. I give them suggestions when they want to find ways to sort of deal with common keyboard issues and hopefully facilitate them in that sort of sense. But you know, there have been some who want to sort of stick to a different approach, and that's absolutely fine. It's not something to dictate and say you must do it because this is what I say, as certain teachers of certain schools are prone to do. In terms of making it natural, and that's a loaded term which is often critiqued in lots of contexts, particularly when you get into cultural theory and so on. But I think it's still a valid term. There is something natural about the human performing mechanism. There is a way of using it that's sort of natural in terms of its capabilities and not stretching it too much to limits which can't be taken. I don't really believe that the weight school playing is particularly natural. I don't think it's natural that the fingers should carry that much weight on them. I think it can be damaging to them. I don't think the sort of approach that you would find, if any of you know the pedagogy of Adele Marcus, formerly one of the grand dames at the Juilliard School, and there's a volume of reprints of edits from the journal Clavier, edited by Dean Elder, who was editor of it, called Pianists That Play, where you have a lot of people who give their technical regimes. It makes it horrendous, really, I think, but especially Marcus's ones, which she was absolutely insistent no one was allowed to play anything until they'd done 2 or 3 hours of these every day. And things like this. Holding down. Very high fingers, over and over again. So, most instant route to tendonitis, I could imagine. And other schools which have very artificially high fingers and are straining them and not letting the rest of the apparatus help them, I don't think those are natural. And I do think the piano is a natural instrument to play. I don't think you need to have extraordinary apparatus. I think most people, as long as they haven't got some sort of crippling factor in the fingers, most people can play to a very high level. It's just a matter of using it most judiciously. So it's the role of a teacher as a facilitator. I've got a PhD student who's just finishing up a thesis on the piano school of Gordon Green in Manchester. He taught people like John Ogden, Peter Donahoe, Martin Roscoe, Martino Torimo, Stephen Huff and others. And he said something which I very much like. He says, the best teacher is the one who makes themselves dispensable as soon as possible. Enables the student with the way of finding their own way, as opposed to the one who tries to sort of build disciples in their own image. I don't think that's a very productive teaching.
Great.
Hello. You mentioned Charles Rose in book Piano Notes, and we know in the last chapter he talks about the pleasure of playing.
Yes.
And I would ask you about this and the epistemological world of mechanics. Do you think one side helps the other? And the question of the search for beauty, how is it for you in the sound?
Well, in terms of what he talks about, the tactile pleasure of playing, there is yes, some kinetic pleasure to be got from that. Yes, I can relate to that. I think that can be tempting to lead some people into sort of pressing the keys and doing all sorts of things which can actually be quite damaging to technique. They're taking some almost carnal pleasure in touching the keys, but that, in ways that have no discernible effect on the sound and can end up sort of distorting the things in it. So I think one needs to approach that with caution. As far as beauty of sound, well, I believe that beauty is a socially constructed category, and this is why I've always responded negatively to those people say that just is beautiful or isn't. I say that involves a whole load of assumptions which are very culturally derived. And I think there are some things which you could say, within reason, a lot of people would find not beautiful. If you turn on a huge amount of white noise at top volume in here, there are reasons that the human oral mechanism would find that sort of, to some extent, painful. And there are of course cases where certain sound produced on the piano may be quite out of character with the type of sound being achieved. But I'd be very reluctant to sort of say there's one idea of what's beautiful that should be used for everything. I think it has to be rethought as a category for each different type of music. So, particularly this question which Rosen alludes to of what I call top voicing, always playing the top note more than the others. It's something that people like Debussy and Messiaen railed against, and I can see why. If you know Debussy's Canapé, the prelude, very common to hear played a bit like this. which is accompanied by much quieter pitches. I prefer a very different approach, which to me, I would like to think sounds a bit more ancestral. Trying to balance those chords as much as possible. I mean, it's something else I could talk about. Balancing chords, I think, is an interesting art, because if you actually play 4 notes in a chord in exactly the same volume, it's somewhat bottom heavy because the lower notes are stronger. So actually, balancing a chord means slightly gradating each note. It gets slightly louder as it gets higher. Bottom heavy to me. But yes, there are schools and technical schools where it's almost impossible not to top voice a chord, and that's just viewed as being what a beautiful way of playing chords is. And I disagree. I think it's one way. It may be beautiful, but it's not the only way. And yes, very authoritarian pedagogues will just say that is just ugly. You cannot play that way. If you read some of the writings of Neuhaus or Marcus or others, you'll see this sort of thing. You can imagine them screaming it at the top of their voice at some of their students and probably hitting them as they do that. This is not a way forward.
Thank you.
A última pergunta?
How can I, as a teacher, approach all of these schools without getting my students in misconception? Because some are contrary with each other and
Sorry, contrarian or
contrary.
contrary? Some, yeah, they're opposing schools. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So how can I approach and don't lose confidence and or maybe lose control of my students, because each one would choose naturally one of these schools.
Well, lose control of your students, is that always necessarily a bad thing? I mean, they will go their own way, and they might do things differently to how you would prefer or would want to do that. Is that necessary to be avoided? But if they have the maximum knowledge of the different possibilities and options, and the same goes for any aspects of interpretation as well, the wider the range of understanding and perception they have of what you can do on the piano, then the more informed decisions hopefully they will make. But ultimately, yes, they have to be their decisions which they prefer, and those will be different because they're all different people. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I would not be too worried on that front.
Great. Thank you, Professor.
I think there's one more question. Do you have a question? No, sorry. I saw another hand up there.
Eu acho que meio que
Yeah,
nós temos que...
we were okay. Normally we can, tomorrow we have, amanhã a gente tem a seminário com o professor.
É,
A gente pode continuar, a gente está com
nós temos que fechar.
uma pressa para sair, a gente volta no período da tarde. Have more touches.
Isso.
Okay.
Okay.
Obrigada.
Thank you very much.